The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed flickered with that familiar, nauseating rhythm that had become the soundtrack to my recovery. My ribs ached with every shallow breath, and the morphine drip wasn't quite enough to dull the sharp edges of pain that radiated through my torso. But none of that compared to the hollow ache in my chest when I heard my father's voice in the hallway just outside my room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "I can't keep doing this, Margaret," he was saying to my stepmother, his tone heavy with exhaustion and something darker. "She's 32 years old and still getting herself into these situations. When does it end?" I turned my head toward the door, the movement sending a spike of agony through my neck. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see his silhouette pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Dr. Harrison, the attending physician, stood nearby with a clipboard, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation unfolding in his presence. "This time, it's 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and internal bleeding," my father continued, his voice rising with each word. "Last year, it was that motorcycle accident. Before that, the rock climbing incident. I'm tired of getting these calls, tired of rushing to hospitals, tired of explaining to people why my daughter can't seem to live a normal, safe life." Margaret's voice was softer, but I caught every word. "Richard, she's hurt. She needs her family right now." "No," he said, and I could hear him stop pacing. "She needs to grow up. She needs to stop this reckless behavior and figure out what she wants to do with her life. I've enabled this long enough." Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Chen, perhaps we should discuss your daughter's condition and recovery plan. She's been through significant trauma." "Doctor," my father interrupted, "I appreciate everything you've done, but I think it's time for some tough love. Maybe if she has to handle this recovery on her own, she'll finally understand the consequences of her choices." The words hit me harder than the truck that had put me in this hospital bed 3 days ago. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the steady beeping of the heart monitor, using it as an anchor against the wave of abandonment washing over me. This wasn't new territory for us. My father, Richard Chen, had built his entire identity around control, predictability, and conventional success. I represented everything he couldn't understand or manage. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn, was why I had been on that highway at 2 in the morning. He didn't know about the call I'd received from the emergency dispatch, or the family of 5 trapped in their overturned SUV. He didn't know that while he saw reckless behavior, I saw a responsibility that superseded my own safety. But that conversation was still 3 days away. To understand how we got to this moment of ultimate betrayal, you need to understand the 2 completely separate lives I had been living for the past 8 years. The story really begins 2 months earlier, at what should have been a celebration. My father had organized one of his elaborate dinner parties at his sprawling house in Westchester County, the kind of event where every detail was designed to impress. The dining room table gleamed under the crystal chandelier, set with his best china and sterling silver. The guest list read like a who's who of local business leaders and politicians, all gathered to celebrate my half-brother David's promotion to partner at his law firm. I sat at the far end of the table, dressed in the simple black dress my stepmother had suggested, watching my father hold court with his usual blend of charm and barely concealed arrogance. David, golden boy extraordinaire, basked in the attention like a cat in sunlight. At 28, he had already achieved everything my father valued: a prestigious career, a socially advantageous engagement to a judge's daughter, and most importantly, a life that made perfect sense within my father's narrow worldview. "To David," my father announced, raising his wine glass with theatrical flourish, "not just for making partner, but for proving that hard work and smart choices lead to real success." The toast was received with polite applause and murmurs of approval. I raised my own glass mechanically, playing my assigned role as the supportive sister, while internally cataloging all the ways this celebration highlighted my own perceived failures. David's law degree versus my criminal justice degree that I'd never used, his corner office versus my unexplained absences and vague references to consulting work, his engagement announcement versus my perpetual single status. After dinner, as the guests moved to the living room for brandy and cigars, I found myself alone with my father in his study. The room was his sanctuary, lined with leather-bound books he'd never read and expensive art he'd purchased more for its price tag than its beauty. He poured himself a generous measure of single malt scotch and settled into his favorite armchair, the one positioned to give him the best view of his achievements displayed throughout the room. "Sophia," he began, using the tone he reserved for conversations he considered important, "I've been thinking about your future." I perched on the edge of the chair across from him, already knowing where this conversation was heading. We'd had variations of it dozens of times over the years. "Dad, I'm doing fine." "Are you?" He leaned forward, his businessman's instincts fully engaged. "You're 32 years old. You have a degree you're not using, no clear career path, and you disappear for weeks at a time doing God knows what. David is making partner, building something real. What are you building?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. What could I tell him? That while David was reviewing contracts and billable hours, I was coordinating disaster relief efforts. That when he was networking at charity galas, I was crawling through collapsed buildings searching for survivors. That his idea of risk was an aggressive investment portfolio, while mine involved rapping down cliff faces in zero visibility conditions. "I'm building experience," I said carefully, "learning new skills, contributing in ways that matter." He snorted, the sound sharp with derision. "Contributing to what? You can't even tell me who you work for or what you actually do. Is it some kind of government thing? Because I know people in government, Sophia, and none of them live the way you do. It's complicated. Everything's complicated with you." He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the manicured lawn that was his pride and joy. "When you were younger, I thought this was just a phase. The adventure sports, the dangerous hobbies, the refusal to settle down. I thought you'd grow out of it. Maybe this is who I grew into." He turned back to face me, and for a moment, I saw something in his expression that might have been genuine concern. "This isn't growing, Sophia. This is running. Running from responsibility, from commitment, from building something lasting. You don't understand what I do." "Then explain it to me." His voice carried the same commanding tone he used in boardrooms. "Tell me exactly what you do that's so important you can't commit to anything else." The moment stretched between us, heavy with 8 years of accumulated misunderstandings. I could have told him then.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I could have explained about the Search and Rescue Coordination Center, about my certification as a wilderness emergency medical technician, about the specialized training that had taken me to places most people only saw in disaster footage on the news. I could have told him about the night shifts spent monitoring emergency frequencies, about the phone that never left my side because 30 seconds could mean the difference between life and death for someone's child, parent, or spouse. Instead, I gave him the same vague answer I'd been giving for years. "I help people." His face hardened. "We all help people, Sophia. David helps people navigate complex legal issues. I help people build their businesses. But we do it in ways that matter, in ways that build something sustainable. Not everything that matters can be measured in profit margins. And not everything that feels meaningful actually makes a difference." He returned to his chair, the conversation clearly winding down in his mind. "I love you, sweetheart, but love isn't enough anymore. You need to make some real decisions about your life." That night, after the guests had gone home and David had returned to his own apartment with his fiancée, I stood on the deck outside my old bedroom, looking up at the stars, barely visible through the light pollution of suburban success. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jake Morrison, my partner at the Rescue Coordination Center. "Weather window opening tomorrow. Overdue hiker on Mount Washington. You available?" I typed back without hesitation. "On my way." My father thought I was running from responsibility. What he didn't understand was that I was running toward it, toward the kind of responsibility that didn't fit neatly into his spreadsheets and strategic plans. The kind that woke you up at 3 in the morning because someone's child was missing in the wilderness, or because a climbing accident had left 2 people stranded on a ledge with hypothermia setting in. The next morning, I was 3 hours north of Westchester County, strapping on climbing gear in the pre-dawn darkness. Jake was already checking the weather reports on his tablet, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen.
At 45, he'd been doing search and rescue longer than I'd been alive, and his weathered face told the story of thousands of hours spent in conditions that most people went to great lengths to avoid. Single male, 24 years old, experienced hiker, but went out alone, he briefed me as we loaded our packs. Lost contact with his emergency contact 36 hours ago. Last known position was the northern approach to the summit. Weather? Deteriorating fast. We've got maybe 8 hours before the next storm system moves in. He looked up at the sky, where the first gray clouds were beginning to gather. After that, we're looking at 3 days minimum before conditions improve enough for another attempt. I shouldered my pack, feeling the familiar weight of rope, medical supplies, emergency shelter, and all the other equipment that might mean the difference between bringing someone home alive or bringing them home at all. This was the weight my father couldn't understand, the responsibility he dismissed as reckless adventuring. Let's bring him home. The hike began in the kind of pristine silence that only exists in the mountains before dawn. Our headlamps carved narrow tunnels of light through the darkness as we followed the trail markers deeper into the wilderness. The temperature was dropping steadily, and I could see my breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. Jake and I had worked together for 3 years, and our partnership had evolved into something that required very little verbal communication. We moved at a steady pace, conserving energy for what we both knew could be a long day, stopping periodically to check our GPS coordinates and listen for any sounds that might indicate the presence of our missing hiker. 2 hours into the hike, as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the tree canopy, we found the first sign. A protein bar wrapper, partially buried under fallen leaves, exactly the brand that had been listed in the missing person report. Jake marked the GPS coordinates while I examined the surrounding area for any other clues. He was moving north, I called out, pointing to a barely visible footprint in the soft earth near a stream crossing. But he's off the main trail. Lost or taking a shortcut? Hard to tell. I stood and adjusted my pack straps. Either way, he's in the danger zone now. The danger zone was our term for the area above the tree line, where weather conditions could change from manageable to lethal in a matter of minutes. It was also where most of our successful rescues turned into body recoveries, especially when hikers were traveling alone and without proper emergency equipment. As we climbed higher, the signs became more frequent and more concerning. Pieces of torn fabric on tree branches suggested someone moving through the forest in poor visibility or deteriorating mental condition. Scattered energy bar wrappers indicated someone who was consuming their emergency food supply faster than planned, possibly due to cold-induced calorie burn or poor rationing decisions. He's hypothermic, Jake observed, examining a water bottle that had been abandoned beside the trail. No one in their right mind leaves their water behind. I checked my watch. We'd been hiking for 4 hours, and the weather was beginning to deteriorate exactly as predicted. The wind had picked up significantly, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. In another 4 hours, this mountain would become a death trap for anyone without proper shelter. There, I said, pointing to a flash of bright orange, barely visible through the trees about 100 yards off the trail. Emergency bivvy. We approached carefully, calling out as we moved closer. Emergency protocol required us to announce our presence clearly and repeatedly, both to avoid startling someone who might be in a compromised mental state and to ensure our own safety if the situation had become dangerous. Search and rescue, Jake called out in his clear, authoritative voice. We're here to help. The figure in the orange emergency shelter was motionless, and for a moment, I feared we were too late. But as we got closer, I could see the slight rise and fall of breathing and the reflexive movement of someone drifting in and out of consciousness. Hey there, I said, dropping to my knees beside the shelter. I'm Sophia, and this is Jake. We're with Mountain Rescue. Can you tell me your name? The young man inside the bivvy opened his eyes, and I could immediately see the telltale signs of moderate hypothermia. His pupils were dilated, his movements were sluggish, and his speech, when it came, was slightly slurred. Michael, he managed. Michael Harrison. I think I'm in trouble. You're going to be okay, Michael, I assured him, already reaching for my medical kit. We're going to get you warmed up and get you out of here. What followed was 2 hours of intensive field medicine and technical rescue work. Michael's core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and he was showing signs of frostbite on his extremities. Jake worked on setting up emergency shelter and preparing hot liquids, while I focused on medical stabilization and rewarming procedures. The weather continued to deteriorate around us, and I knew that our window for a walking evacuation was rapidly closing. Michael was conscious and responsive, but his mobility was severely compromised, and the trail down the mountain was becoming increasingly treacherous with each passing minute. "We need to call for helicopter evacuation," I told Jake during a brief moment when Michael had drifted off to sleep. "In this weather?" I looked up at the sky, where the snow was now falling heavily and the wind was gusting strong enough to make the trees around us creak ominously. "It's borderline, but if we wait, we'll be stuck here for 3 days, and I don't think he can maintain core temperature that long." Jake nodded and reached for the satellite phone. The helicopter evacuation request required a detailed medical assessment, weather report, and risk analysis that would be reviewed by the flight crew before they made the decision to attempt a rescue in marginal conditions. While we waited for a response, I continued monitoring Michael's condition and administering emergency medical care. His temperature was stabilizing, but he remained in a dangerous state, drifting in and out of lucidity as his body struggled to recover from the hypothermic episode.
"Sophia," he said during one of his more alert moments, "I need to tell you something." "What is it, Michael?" "I'm getting married next month." His voice was clearer now, but filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. I was up here trying to figure out if I was making the right decision. "And did you figure it out?" He smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him all day. "Yeah, I want to go home." 20 minutes later, we heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. The pilot, a woman I'd worked with on dozens of previous rescues, managed to find a landing zone barely large enough for the aircraft in conditions that most pilots would have considered impossible. As we loaded Michael into the helicopter for transport to the nearest trauma center, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing me home." I squeezed his hand back. That's what we do. The flight down the mountain took 12 minutes. The hike back to our vehicles took Jake and me another 6 hours through worsening weather conditions. By the time we reached the parking area, we were both exhausted, cold, and running on the kind of adrenaline that only comes from successfully completing a high-stakes rescue operation. "Another one for the win column," Jake said as we loaded our gear into his truck. "Another family that gets to sleep tonight knowing their son is coming home," I replied. That night, I drove back to Westchester County with my phone buzzing constantly with updates from the hospital. Michael Harrison was in stable condition, recovering well from his hypothermic episode and expected to make a full recovery. His fiancée had arrived from Boston and was staying with him. His parents were flying in from California. None of them knew my name or would ever be able to thank me personally. That wasn't how search and rescue worked. We operated in the background, invisible and unacknowledged, motivated not by recognition, but by the simple knowledge that what we did mattered in the most fundamental way possible. When I finally pulled into my father's driveway at 2 a.m, the house was dark and silent. I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking up at the windows of the home where I'd grown up, thinking about the conversation we'd had the night before. My father thought I was running from responsibility, that I was afraid to build something meaningful with my life. If only he knew that while he was sleeping safely in his bed, I had spent the day literally carrying someone else's child down a mountain in a blizzard. That the phone in my pocket connected me to a network of people who trusted me with their most precious possessions, the lives of their loved ones. That the skills he dismissed as dangerous hobbies were actually the tools I used to make sure other families didn't have to experience the kind of loss that changed everything forever. But I couldn't tell him any of that, because the moment I tried to explain what I really did, he would find 1,000 ways to minimize it, to explain why it wasn't real work, why it wasn't sustainable, why it wasn't enough. So instead, I sat in the darkness and promised myself that someday, somehow, he would understand who I really was. Not the disappointing daughter who couldn't commit to anything, but the person who had dedicated her life to making sure that when everything went wrong for someone else, there was at least one person trained and ready to make it right again. I had no idea that 2 months later, I would be lying in a hospital bed, listening to him explain to a doctor why he couldn't be bothered to help with my recovery.
I had no idea that the accident that would nearly kill me would also be the moment when he finally learned who his daughter really was. But that night, sitting in his driveway with mountain rescue gear still in my back seat, and the satisfaction of another successful save warming me more than any heater could, I was still naive enough to believe that someday he might see me for who I was without having to lose me first. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. My father thought I was the one who needed to grow up, to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. What he didn't understand was that I had already figured it out years ago. While he was building a business empire designed to impress people at dinner parties, I was building something else entirely. A life dedicated to making sure that other people's children came home safely. The difference was that his work ended when he left the office. Mine began when other people's emergency started. His success was measured in profit margins and quarterly reports. Mine was measured in phone calls from grateful families and hospital discharge papers that meant someone would be okay. But to explain that to him would require him to understand that there were different kinds of success, different ways to measure a life well lived. And as I finally got out of my car and walked toward the front door of his perfect house, I realized that conversation was still a long way off. 2 months later, when I was lying in that hospital bed listening to him abandon me, I would remember this moment and understand that some people never learn to see beyond their own definitions of worth. But I would also learn that sometimes the universe has its own way of teaching lessons, and that the truth has a way of revealing itself, whether we're ready for it or not. The first lesson would come from a truck that ran a red light at 2 in the morning. The second would come from a nurse who knew exactly who I was and what I had been doing on that highway when everything went wrong. But that night, I was still the invisible daughter, carrying secrets that felt too big to share and wondering if I would ever find a way to bridge the gap between who my father thought I was and who I actually was. Little did I know, that bridge was about to be built for me, in the most devastating and redemptive way possible. The weeks following that mountain rescue blurred together in a haze of emergency calls and family obligations that felt increasingly hollow. I found myself living in 2 completely separate realities, switching between them so seamlessly that sometimes I forgot which version of myself I was supposed to be at any given moment. At home, I was still the wayward daughter who couldn't seem to find her place in the world. At the coordination center, I was the person teams called when conventional rescue methods weren't enough. 3 weeks after bringing Michael Harrison down from Mount Washington, I was sitting in my father's kitchen on a Sunday morning, nursing a cup of coffee and half listening to him read stock reports aloud to Margaret. The normalcy of it felt surreal after spending the previous night coordinating a multi-agency response to a flash flood that had trapped a family of 4 in their vehicle. I'd been awake for 36 hours straight, but to my father, I just looked tired from another late night of whatever vaguely irresponsible activities he imagined I was pursuing. The market's been volatile lately, he was saying, flipping through the financial section with practiced efficiency. But the tech sector is showing resilience. David's been smart to diversify his portfolio early. Margaret nodded appropriately, playing her role as the supportive wife who found her husband's business acumen endlessly fascinating. He's always been so practical about money. Unlike some people, my father added, glancing meaningfully in my direction. Sophia, have you given any more thought to what we discussed about your future? I looked up from my coffee, fighting the urge to tell him that while he'd been sleeping peacefully the night before, I'd helped save 4 lives and reunite a family that had thought they were going to die. Instead, I gave him the same non-committal response I'd been perfecting for years. I'm exploring some options. Options, he repeated, the word carrying the weight of his disappointment. At your age, I wasn't exploring options. I was building something concrete. The irony was almost overwhelming. The night before, I'd coordinated rescue teams from 3 different counties, managed communications with state police helicopters, and personally rappelled down a 60-foot embankment to reach victims who were trapped in rising water. While my father was building his concrete empire of quarterly profits and business relationships, I was literally pulling people out of life-or-death situations. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, the distinctive tone that meant emergency dispatch. I glanced at the screen and saw Jake's number, along with a text that made my blood run cold. Multi-vehicle accident on Highway 87, mass casualty event, all available units responding, need you ASAP. I stood up so quickly that my chair scraped against the tile floor, the sound sharp and sudden in the quiet kitchen. My father looked up from his newspaper with the expression of mild annoyance he reserved for interruptions to his morning routine. "I have to go," I said, already reaching for my keys. "Go where?" Margaret asked, genuine concern in her voice. "Sophia, you look exhausted. Maybe you should rest today." "It's an emergency." My father folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, the gesture somehow managing to convey both authority and exasperation. "Everything's an emergency with you."
Can't someone else handle whatever crisis du jour this is? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 8 years of accumulated frustration and misunderstanding. I could have told him that no, actually, there weren't that many people trained to handle the kind of emergency I was about to walk into. I could have explained that mass casualty events required specialized skills and experience that took years to develop. I could have mentioned that when people's lives hung in the balance, the luxury of choosing whether or not to respond simply didn't exist. Instead, I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. "I'll call you later." "Sophia," my father called after me, his voice carrying the tone he'd used when I was a teenager missing curfew. "We need to finish this conversation." "Later, Dad." 20 minutes later, I was standing on the shoulder of Highway 87, surrounded by the controlled chaos that defined every major emergency response. The accident scene stretched across 3 lanes of interstate, involving 2 commercial trucks and at least 6 passenger vehicles. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the highway, their red and blue lights painting the morning sky in urgent colors that made everything feel simultaneously more real and more surreal. Jake found me as I was pulling on my reflective safety vest, his face grim with the kind of expression that meant the situation was worse than the initial reports had indicated. "What's the count?" I asked, following into step beside him as we approached the incident command post. 17 confirmed casualties so far, but we're still working through the debris field, he said, consulting the tablet that contained real-time updates from all the response teams. The first truck lost control in the fog and jackknifed across all lanes. The second truck couldn't stop in time, and then it became a chain reaction. I could see the scene more clearly now, and my mind automatically began processing the tactical challenges we were facing. The twisted metal and scattered debris created a maze of potential hazards, while the positioning of the vehicles meant that several victims were trapped in spaces that would require complex extraction procedures. "State police have established a perimeter, and the fire department is handling initial extraction," Jake continued. "But we've got at least 3 victims in positions that are going to require specialized rescue techniques." "What kind of positions?" He pointed toward the far end of the accident scene, where the cab of one of the commercial trucks had been crushed against the concrete barrier that separated the northbound and southbound lanes. "Drivers trapped in there, conscious but pinned by the steering column. Fire department can't get the right angle with their equipment because of how the truck is positioned against the barrier." I studied the wreckage, mentally calculating angles and anchor points for a rope rescue system. "We'll need to approach from above. Can we get ladder truck access to the overpass?" "Already requested." "But there's more." Jake's expression grew even more serious. "Family of 3 in a sedan that ended up underneath the trailer of the second truck. Parents are conscious, but their daughter is unconscious, and we can't assess the extent of her injuries without moving her. Age: 7 years old." The number hit me like a physical blow. 7 years old meant small body mass, higher risk of internal injuries, and a trauma response that could be complicated by fear and confusion, even if she regained consciousness. It also meant parents who were probably experiencing the worst moments of their lives, trapped and helpless while their child lay unconscious just beyond their reach. "What's the access situation?" "Tight, really tight. The car is compressed between the truck's rear axle and the trailer bed. Fire department estimates about 18 inches, maybe less." I looked at the scene again, this time focusing on the specific vehicle Jake had indicated. The sedan was barely visible beneath the massive truck trailer, its roof crushed down to window level. The fact that anyone inside was still alive was nothing short of miraculous, but extracting them would require someone small enough to maneuver in an extremely confined space while performing complex medical procedures. "I can fit," I said, already mentally preparing for what would likely be the most technically challenging rescue of my career. "Sophia, the structural integrity is questionable at best.
If that trailer shifts even a few inches, then we better make sure it doesn't shift. The next 3 hours tested every skill I'd developed over 8 years of search and rescue work. The extraction of the truck driver required building an improvised rope system anchored to the overpass above, then rappelling down to create access points that the fire department's equipment couldn't reach. It was precise, methodical work that had to be performed while traffic continued to back up for miles in both directions, and media helicopters circled overhead. But it was the family trapped under the truck trailer that would stay with me forever. Getting to them required crawling through a space so confined that I had to remove most of my equipment and push it ahead of me as I inched forward on my belly. The smell of leaking gasoline and hydraulic fluid was overwhelming in the enclosed space, and every few minutes I could feel the entire structure shift slightly as rescue teams worked to stabilize the vehicles above me. When I finally reached the family, I found myself face to face with a father whose eyes held the kind of desperate hope that only comes when someone you love is in mortal danger. His wife was conscious, but clearly in shock, her attention focused entirely on their daughter, who lay motionless in the back seat. "Please," the father whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of rescue equipment operating above us. "Please help her." I squeezed forward until I could reach the little girl, my headlamp providing the only illumination in the cramped space. Her pulse was weak but steady, and her breathing was shallow but regular. More importantly, her pupils responded to light, which meant brain function was likely intact despite her unconscious state. "What's her name?" I asked, beginning my medical assessment while trying to project calm confidence for the benefit of her parents. "Emma," her mother answered. "Emma Rodriguez. She just turned 7 last month." "Emma's going to be okay," I told them, hoping that my words would prove true. "I'm going to get her stabilized, and then we're going to get all of you out of here." What followed was 45 minutes of the most technically complex field medicine I'd ever performed. Working in a space barely larger than a coffin, with limited equipment and the constant threat of structural collapse, I managed to establish an IV line, immobilize Emma's spine, and prepare her for extraction. Her parents watched every move I made with the kind of intensity that comes from understanding that someone else holds your child's life in their hands. "You're really good at this," Emma's father said during a brief moment when I was waiting for additional medical supplies to be passed down to me. "I've had practice." "What's your name?" The question caught me off guard. In the middle of emergency operations, personal details seemed irrelevant, almost intrusive. But trapped in that confined space with people whose lives I was trying to save, the normal barriers between rescuer and victim felt artificial. "Sophia," I said. "Sophia Chen." "Thank you, Sophia Chen. Whatever happens, thank you for being here." When we finally extracted Emma from the wreckage, she was stable and beginning to regain consciousness. The sight of her small body being carefully loaded into the ambulance, surrounded by paramedics and equipment, was both heartbreaking and profoundly satisfying. Her parents rode with her to the hospital, but not before her father found me in the crowd of emergency responders. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, tears streaming down his face. "You saved our little girl." "That's what we do," I replied, echoing the words I'd said to Michael Harrison on the mountain just weeks earlier. As the ambulances pulled away and the cleanup crews began the long process of clearing the highway, I found myself standing beside my truck, suddenly aware of how exhausted I was. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the rescue operation was beginning to fade, leaving behind the familiar combination of physical exhaustion and emotional satisfaction that came with successful emergency work. Jake appeared beside me, looking equally drained but satisfied.
"Hell of a day," he said. "Hell of a day," I agreed. "You should head home, get some rest." I nodded, but as I drove back toward Westchester County, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with my father that morning. He'd asked if someone else could handle the emergency, as if the work I did was optional, something I chose to do, rather than something I was called to do. The truth was that there probably were other people who could have handled parts of the rescue operation, other rope technicians, other wilderness medics, other coordinators with similar training and experience. But there weren't that many people who could have done all of it, who could have moved seamlessly between the technical rescue work and the complex medical procedures required to save Emma Rodriguez's life. More importantly, there weren't that many people who would have chosen to crawl into that death trap of twisted metal and leaking fuel without hesitation, motivated not by recognition or financial reward, but by the simple knowledge that a 7-year-old girl needed someone to save her life. When I walked into my father's house that evening, still wearing clothes that smelled like gasoline and hydraulic fluid, he was in his study, reviewing quarterly reports. He looked up as I passed by his open door, his expression a mixture of concern and disapproval. "You look terrible," he said. "Where have you been all day?" "Work." "What kind of work leaves you looking like you've been crawling through a junkyard?" I paused in his doorway, suddenly tempted to tell him everything. About the truck driver whose life I'd saved by rappelling down from an overpass, about Emma Rodriguez and the 45 minutes I'd spent performing emergency medicine in a space where most people would have panicked, about the 17 families who would sleep that night knowing their loved ones were alive because people like me existed. Instead, I gave him the same vague answer I always gave, just helping some people with a problem. He shook his head and returned to his reports. "You can't help everyone, Sophia. At some point, you need to start thinking about helping yourself." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple, but it carried more emotional weight than any performance review or quarterly bonus could have provided. "This is Emma's dad. She's awake and asking about the nice lady who helped her. The doctors say she's going to be fine. Thank you for giving us our daughter back." I read the message 3 times, then saved it in a folder on my phone that contained dozens of similar messages. Thank you notes from families I'd helped reunite, updates on recoveries, photos of people celebrating milestones they might never have reached without the intervention of search and rescue teams. It was a portfolio of impact that couldn't be measured in dollars or displayed in a corporate trophy case. It was a collection of moments when the difference between life and death had come down to the fact that someone with the right training had been willing to risk everything to help a stranger. My father thought I was afraid of building something lasting, afraid of real responsibility. What he didn't understand was that I had already built something more lasting than any business empire, a reputation among emergency responders as someone who could be counted on when everything went wrong. A network of people who trusted me with their most important cases because they knew I would treat every rescue as if the victim were my own family member. But explaining that to him would have required him to understand that there were different kinds of success, different ways to measure a life well lived. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, still wearing clothes that carried the scent of the day's work, I realized that conversation might never happen. 2 weeks later, that assumption would be tested in the most dramatic way possible. I was driving home from another emergency call, this one a technical rescue in a collapsed building that had taken most of the night to resolve, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local, so I answered despite the late hour. "Is this Sophia Chen?" The voice was male, middle-aged, with the kind of formal tone that usually meant bad news. "Yes, this is Sophia. This is Detective Martinez with the state police. I'm calling about an incident involving your vehicle registration." My blood went cold. What kind of incident? There was a report of a vehicle, matching your description, leaving the scene of an emergency response on Highway 87 at high speed. We're trying to determine if you were involved in any capacity with the rescue operations that took place there earlier tonight. For a moment, I was confused. I hadn't been anywhere near Highway 87 that night. My emergency call had been 15 miles away, at a construction site where a worker had fallen into a foundation excavation. Then I realized what must have happened. "Detective, I think there might be some confusion. I wasn't on Highway 87 tonight. I was at a rescue operation on the other side of the county." "Can you verify your whereabouts between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m.? I rattled off the details of the construction site rescue, including the names of other responders who could confirm my presence. But even as I provided the information, I felt a growing sense of unease. Someone had reported a vehicle like mine leaving an emergency scene, which meant someone had either made an honest mistake or was deliberately trying to implicate me in something. "Detective, can I ask what kind of incident occurred on Highway 87? There was a pause before he answered. "Hit and run. 5-vehicle accident with multiple casualties. The perpetrator fled the scene before first responders arrived."
The words hit me like a physical blow. Someone had caused a multi-vehicle accident and then left people to die while emergency responders were still en route. It was the exact opposite of everything I stood for, everything I had dedicated my life to preventing. I can provide documentation of my whereabouts tonight, I said, and I can give you contact information for multiple witnesses who can confirm I was at the construction site rescue. That would be helpful. Can you come in tomorrow morning to provide a formal statement? I agreed to meet with Detective Martinez the following day, but as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The timing of the call, the specific mention of my vehicle description, the fact that someone had apparently gone out of their way to implicate me in a hit-and-run accident, all of it felt too convenient to be coincidental. The next morning, I arrived at the state police barracks with a folder containing documentation of my presence at the construction site rescue, including photographs, radio logs, and contact information for 6 different witnesses. Detective Martinez was professional but thorough, taking my statement and reviewing all the documentation I'd provided. "This all checks out," he said, after spending an hour verifying details. "Clearly, you weren't involved in the Highway 87 incident. Do you have any idea who made the initial report?" "Anonymous tip. But based on your documentation and the timing, it's obvious that whoever called it in was either mistaken or deliberately providing false information." I left the police station feeling vindicated but troubled. Someone had gone to considerable effort to connect me to a hit-and-run accident, and I couldn't figure out why. I had no enemies that I knew of, no ongoing conflicts that might motivate someone to make false accusations against me. It wasn't until I was driving home that my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed my father's number. "Sophia, where are you?" His voice carried a tone of barely controlled anger that I hadn't heard since my teenage years. "Driving home from the police station. Why?" "The police station?" The anger in his voice was replaced by confusion. "What were you doing at the police station?"
Someone made a false report connecting me to a hit-and-run accident. I had to provide a statement to clear it up. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When my father spoke again, his voice was different, loaded with a kind of disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "Sophia, we need to talk. Can you come home? Now?" "Dad, what's going on?" "Just come home." When I walked into my father's studies 30 minutes later, I found him sitting behind his desk with Detective Martinez's business card in his hand. Margaret was standing by the window, her face pale and drawn with worry. "Sit down," my father said, his voice carrying the weight of a conversation that was about to change everything. I remained standing. "Dad, what's this about?" He held up the business card. "Detective Martinez called me this morning. He wanted to verify some information about you." "What kind of information?" "He mentioned that you'd been questioned in connection with a hit-and-run accident." My father's voice was steady, but I could see the disappointment and confusion in his eyes. "He also mentioned that you'd claimed to be involved in some kind of rescue operation." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. "You don't believe me." "Sophia, I've been patient with your stories about helping people and emergency work, but this has gone too far." He stood up and walked around the desk to face me directly. "A police detective called to ask questions about my daughter's involvement in a serious criminal incident. Do you understand how that makes me look?" "How it makes you look?" "I have a reputation in this community. I have business relationships that depend on trust and credibility." His voice was rising now, 8 years of accumulated frustration finally finding its outlet. "I can't have my daughter involved in police investigations and hit-and-run accidents." "I wasn't involved in a hit-and-run accident. I was cleared of any wrongdoing." "Because you happened to be at some other emergency that night." He shook his head. "Sophia, do you realize how this sounds? You're telling me that you just happened to be at a different emergency when someone reported seeing your car at a hit-and-run scene?" "Yes, because that's what happened." "Or because you've created an elaborate fantasy about being some kind of emergency responder to cover up whatever you're really doing with your time." The accusation hung in the air between us like a challenge. My father was suggesting that everything I'd told him about my work, everything I dedicated my life to for the past 8 years, was an elaborate lie designed to hide some kind of criminal behavior. "You think I'm lying about what I do?"
I think you're confused about what you do. His voice softened slightly, but the words cut just as deep. I think you've been living in some kind of fantasy where you're the hero saving people, when the reality is that you're just another person with problems who needs help. Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Sophia, your father and I have been talking. We think it might be time to consider getting you some professional help. Professional help? Therapy, my father said. Someone who can help you distinguish between reality and whatever elaborate story you've been telling yourself about your life. I stared at them both, suddenly understanding that this conversation had been building for years. They hadn't just dismissed my work as unimportant, they had convinced themselves that it didn't exist at all. In their minds, I was a delusional young woman who had constructed an elaborate fantasy to avoid facing the reality of my own failures. You think I'm lying about what I do? I think you're confused about what you do. His voice softened slightly, but the words cut just as deep. I think you've been living in some kind of fantasy where you're the hero saving people, when the reality is that you're just another person with problems who needs help. Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Sophia, your father and I have been talking. We think it might be time to consider getting you some professional help. Professional help? Therapy, my father said. Someone who can help you distinguish between reality and whatever elaborate story you've been telling yourself about your life. I stared at them both, suddenly understanding that this conversation had been building for years. They hadn't just dismissed my work as unimportant, they had convinced themselves that it didn't exist at all. In their minds, I was a delusional young woman who had constructed an elaborate fantasy to avoid facing the reality of my own failures. You think I'm lying about what I do? I think you're confused about what you do. His voice softened slightly, but the words cut just as deep. I think you've been living in some kind of fantasy where you're the hero saving people, when the reality is that you're just another person with problems who needs help. Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Sophia, your father and I have been talking. We think it might be time to consider getting you some professional help. Professional help? Therapy, my father said. Someone who can help you distinguish between reality and whatever elaborate story you've been telling yourself about your life. I stared at them both, suddenly understanding that this conversation had been building for years. They hadn't just dismissed my work as unimportant, they had convinced themselves that it didn't exist at all. In their minds, I was a delusional young woman who had constructed an elaborate fantasy to avoid facing the reality of my own failures. You think I'm lying about what I do? I think you're confused about what you do. His voice softened slightly, but the words cut just as deep. I think you've been living in some kind of fantasy where you're the hero saving people, when the reality is that you're just another person with problems who needs help. Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Sophia, your father and I have been talking. We think it might be time to consider getting you some professional help. Professional help? Therapy, my father said. Someone who can help you distinguish between reality and whatever elaborate story you've been telling yourself about your life. I stared at them both, suddenly understanding that this conversation had been building for years. They hadn't just dismissed my work as unimportant, they had convinced themselves that it didn't exist at all. In their minds, I was a delusional young woman who had constructed an elaborate fantasy to avoid facing the reality of my own failures. You think I'm making it all up? I think you need help, my father said. And I think the first step is admitting that whatever you think you've been doing, it's not real. I could have argued with them. I could have produced documentation, photographs, testimonials from the families I'd helped. I could have called Jake or any of the dozen emergency responders who would have vouched for my training and experience. Instead, I walked out of his study and went upstairs to pack a bag. 2 hours later, I was loading my belongings into my truck while my father and Margaret watched from the front porch. The conversation we'd had in his study had clarified something that I'd been refusing to acknowledge for years. The gap between who I was and who they thought I was had become unbridgeable. "Where will you go?" Margaret asked, genuine concern in her voice despite everything that had happened. "I'll figure it out." My father stepped forward, his expression a mixture of frustration and something that might have been regret. "Sophia, this doesn't have to be permanent. When you're ready to get help, when you're ready to face reality, you're always welcome here. I looked at him for a long moment, memorizing his face and the disappointed expression that had become so familiar over the years. "The reality is that you don't know who your daughter is," I said, "and you've never bothered to find out." As I drove away from the house where I'd grown up, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with profound sadness. I was finally free from the exhausting effort of trying to earn approval from people who would never understand or value what I'd built with my life. But I was also alone in a way I'd never been before, cut off from the only family I'd ever known. I drove to Jake's house, where I spent the night on his couch while we talked about the confrontation with my father and the false police report that had triggered it. Jake listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just letting me process what had happened. "You know this isn't over," he said, as we sat on his back deck, watching the sunrise over the mountains where we'd spent so many hours saving lives together. "What do you mean?" "People like your father don't change their opinions easily, but they do change them when reality becomes impossible to ignore. I don't think reality is going to intrude on his worldview anytime soon." Jake smiled, the expression carrying a kind of wisdom that came from years of watching dramatic reversals in emergency situations. Reality has a way of making itself known when you least expect it. 2 weeks later, I would understand exactly what he meant. The call came at 1:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, cutting through the silence of my small apartment like a knife. I'd been renting a studio above a coffee shop in the mountains, close enough to the coordination center that I could respond to emergencies within minutes, far enough from my old life that I could finally breathe without the constant weight of disapproval pressing down on my chest. I grabbed my phone on the second ring, instantly alert despite having been deep asleep moments before. "Sophia, we've got a big one." Jake's voice carried the tension that meant something catastrophic had happened. "Multi-vehicle collision on Highway 15, southbound near Miller's Crossing. Initial reports suggest at least 20 cars involved, possible fatalities." I was already reaching for my clothes before he finished speaking. "Weather conditions?"
Heavy fog, near zero visibility. State police have shut down the entire southbound stretch, but we're still getting secondary accidents as vehicles approach the scene. ETA? 20 minutes if you leave now. But Sophia, there's something else. Jake's voice carried a note I couldn't quite identify. "One of the vehicles involved matches the description of your father's car. Dark blue BMW sedan, license plate beginning with RC." The world seemed to stop moving for a moment. My father drove a dark blue BMW with vanity plates that started with his initials. He often traveled that stretch of highway when returning from business meetings in Albany. The chances of it being a coincidence were possible, but the cold knot forming in my stomach told me otherwise. Any confirmation on occupants? Not yet. Scenes still too chaotic for individual vehicle identification, but I thought you should know before you got here. I finished dressing in record time, my mind automatically shifting into emergency response mode, even as a deeper part of me grappled with the possibility that my father might be among the casualties I was about to try to save. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter he'd accused of living in a fantasy world might be the only thing standing between him and death. The drive to the accident scene took me through back roads I could navigate blindfolded, past landmarks that had become familiar through dozens of previous emergency calls. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the work I dedicated my life to might intersect with my personal world in the most devastating way possible. When I arrived at the staging area, the scale of the disaster became immediately apparent. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the highway for nearly a quarter mile, their red and blue lights creating an eerie aurora through the thick fog that still blanketed the entire area. The smell of twisted metal, leaking fuel, and something worse hung heavy in the air. Jake found me as I was pulling on my gear, his face grim in the harsh light of the emergency floodlights that had been set up throughout the scene. "What's the situation?" I asked, forcing myself to focus on the technical aspects of the response rather than the personal implications. 43 vehicles involved, spread across nearly half a mile of highway. We've got confirmed fatalities, but the count is still preliminary. He consulted his tablet, scrolling through real-time updates from the various response teams. The fog created a perfect storm. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, but traffic was still moving at highway speeds when the initial accident occurred. What triggered it? Semi-truck jackknifed when the driver overcorrected after clipping a guardrail.
created a complete blockade across all lanes, and vehicles behind it had no warning until they were already in the impact zone. I scanned the scene, my mind automatically categorizing the tactical challenges we were facing. The fog made it dangerous for responders to move between vehicles, the twisted metal created numerous entrapment situations, and the sheer number of casualties meant we were operating with limited resources stretched across an enormous area. "Where do you need me?" Jake pointed toward the far end of the accident scene, where several emergency vehicles were clustered around what appeared to be the most severely damaged cars. "We've got multiple entrapments in that sector. Fire department is handling initial extraction, but there are at least 3 vehicles where we'll need specialized rescue techniques." "Any word on the BMW?" His expression grew more serious. "Vehicle matching that description is in Sector 7, near the point of initial impact. Fire department hasn't been able to access it yet due to structural concerns with an overturned truck trailer that's pinning it against the barrier wall." My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to maintain professional composure. "How many occupants?" "Unknown. Could be anywhere from 1 to 4, based on the vehicle size." I nodded and shouldered my medical kit, the familiar weight of emergency equipment serving as an anchor against the emotional storm threatening to overwhelm my professional training. "Let's go." The walk through the accident scene was like navigating through a battlefield. Cars were scattered at impossible angles, some flipped completely over, others compressed to half their original size by the force of multiple impacts. Emergency responders moved between the vehicles like ghosts in the fog, their voices calling out medical updates and coordination instructions that echoed strangely in the muffled air. We passed vehicle after vehicle where teams were working to extract injured occupants. A family of 4 being loaded into ambulances, all conscious and talking. An elderly couple sitting on the tailgate of a paramedic truck holding hands while being treated for minor injuries. A young man arguing with paramedics who wanted to transport him to the hospital despite his insistence that he was fine. Each successful extraction felt like a small victory against the overwhelming scope of the disaster. But as we moved deeper into the scene, the casualties became more severe, the extractions more complex, and the race against time more urgent. When we finally reached Sector 7, I could see the BMW immediately. It was wedged between the concrete barrier wall and the undercarriage of an overturned semi-trailer compressed into a space that looked impossibly small. The driver's side was completely inaccessible, and the passenger side was partially blocked by debris from other vehicles. "Structural assessment?" I asked the fire chief who was coordinating the extraction efforts in that sector. "Trailers being held in place by the cab and another passenger car, but the stability is questionable. Any significant movement could cause the whole thing to shift, which would likely crush whatever's left of the BMW." I studied the scene, calculating angles and anchor points for a potential rescue operation. The technical challenges were significant, but not insurmountable. More importantly, I could see signs of movement inside the BMW, which meant at least one occupant was still alive. "I can get in there," I said, "but I'll need a full rigging team and someone monitoring the structural integrity of that trailer while I work." "Sophia," Jake said quietly, "are you sure you want to be the one to go in there?" The question carried weight beyond its technical implications. He was asking if I was emotionally prepared to discover that the person trapped in that vehicle might be my father, and whether I could maintain professional effectiveness if that turned out to be the case. "I'm the smallest person on the team and the most experienced with confined space medicine," I replied. "Personal considerations don't change the tactical requirements." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Personal considerations were screaming through my mind, creating a background of anxiety and dread that I'd never experienced during an emergency response. The possibility that I might be about to crawl into twisted wreckage to save the life of a man who'd spent the last month convinced that I was delusional was almost overwhelming. The rigging process took 20 minutes, during which time I could hear voices from inside the BMW. A man's voice, weak but conscious, calling for help. A woman's voice, more distressed, asking about someone named Richard. My hands shook slightly as I checked my equipment, the professional calm I'd cultivated over years of emergency work threatening to crack under the weight of personal involvement. "Structural monitors are in place," the fire chief reported. "You've got real-time communication with the engineering team. Any sign of movement in that trailer, and we pull you out immediately." I nodded and began the careful process of working my way into the compressed space between the vehicle and the debris. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, and I could hear the ominous creaking of metal under stress as I moved deeper into the wreckage. When I finally reached the interior of the BMW, my worst fears were confirmed. My father was trapped behind the steering wheel, conscious but clearly in significant pain. Margaret was in the passenger seat, her face pale with shock and what appeared to be a serious head injury. Sophia? My father's voice was weak, confused, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to get you out," I said, already beginning my medical assessment while trying to determine the best approach for extraction. "I don't understand."
How did you— Dad, I need you to stay calm and let me work. I could see that his left leg was pinned by the crushed dashboard, and there was blood on his shirt that suggested possible internal injuries. Can you feel your legs? Yes, but I can't move my left foot, and Margaret hasn't been responsive for the last few minutes. I turned my attention to Margaret, checking her pulse and pupil response. She was unconscious but stable, with a significant laceration on her forehead that would require immediate medical attention once we got her extracted. "She's going to be okay," I told my father, beginning the process of establishing IV access in the confined space. "But we need to get both of you out of here as quickly as possible." "Sophia, I still don't understand how you're here. How did you know about the accident?" I paused in my work, meeting his eyes in the dim light of my headlamp. "This is what I do, Dad. This is my job." For the first time in our relationship, my father was seeing me in my element. Not the disappointing daughter who couldn't commit to anything, not the delusional young woman who made up stories about helping people, but the trained professional who had crawled into a death trap to save his life. "Your job?" "I'm a certified wilderness emergency medical technician and technical rescue specialist. I coordinate search and rescue operations for the entire northern region." I continued working as I spoke, my hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the emotional weight of the conversation. When there's a mass casualty event like this, I'm one of the people they call. My father stared at me for a long moment, processing information that fundamentally challenged everything he'd believed about my life for the past 8 years. "But you never told me." "I tried to tell you. You didn't want to hear it." The next 40 minutes were the most technically challenging and emotionally complex of my career. Working in a space barely large enough for one person, with the constant threat of structural collapse, I managed to stabilize both my father and Margaret while coordinating their extraction with the teams working above us. My father remained conscious throughout the process, watching me work with an expression of growing amazement and understanding. For the first time, he was seeing the skills he'd dismissed as dangerous hobbies being used to save lives. The rope work he'd criticized as reckless adventuring, the medical training he'd never bothered to ask about, the physical conditioning he'd seen as evidence of an inability to settle down. "The training for this," he said, during a brief moment when I was waiting for additional equipment to be passed down to me. "How long does it take?" "Years," I replied. "Continuous education, recertification, specialized courses. I spend about 40 hours a month just maintaining my qualifications. And you've been doing this for 8 years, since I left college." When we finally extracted him from the wreckage, my father was loaded onto a backboard and prepared for transport to the regional trauma center. As the paramedics wheeled him toward the ambulance, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice thick with pain medication and emotion. "I owe you a lot of apologies." "We can talk about that later," I replied. "Right now, you need to focus on getting better." But he didn't let go of my hand. "Sophia, I need to know. How many people have you saved?" The question caught me off guard. In 8 years of emergency response work, I'd never tried to calculate a total number. Rescues blended together in memory, defined more by their technical challenges and emotional impact than by simple arithmetic. "I don't keep count." "Guess." I thought about it for a moment, mentally reviewing the major operations I'd been involved in. Individual rescues? Maybe 150. But mass casualty events like this one involve team efforts. It's not about individual credit. My father's eyes widened. 150 people? "Dad, you really need to get to the hospital." "One more question." His grip on my hand tightened. "Why didn't you make me understand?" The question hung in the air between us as the paramedics began loading him into the ambulance.
It was the same question I'd been asking myself for years, but hearing it from him gave it a different weight. Because you didn't want to understand, I said finally. You wanted me to be someone else. 3 days later, I was sitting in my father's hospital room while he recovered from surgery to repair his shattered leg. Margaret was in the room next door, awake and coherent, but still being monitored for her head injury. The immediate medical crisis had passed, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. The nurse told me something interesting, my father said, breaking a long silence that had stretched between us while he processed everything that had happened. What's that? She said you're something of a legend among the emergency response community. Apparently, there are nurses and paramedics who specifically request to work with your team because they know the level of care will be exceptional. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. I work with good people. She also said that you've been involved in some of the most complex rescues in the region's history, including something called the Whitmore Mine incident. The Whitmore Mine incident had been 18 months earlier, a cave-in that trapped 4 miners for 36 hours while rescue teams worked to reach them through unstable rock formations. It had been one of the most technically challenging operations of my career, requiring specialized equipment and techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in underground rescue work. That was a team effort. Sophia, stop deflecting. My father's voice carried a note of authority that I recognized from my childhood, but this time it was tempered with something that might have been respect. I'm trying to understand what you've built with your life. Why does it matter now? Because I've spent the last 3 days lying in this bed thinking about what you said to me in that car. You told me I didn't want to understand, that I wanted you to be someone else. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. You were right. The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge that neither of us was quite ready to cross. My father had built his entire relationship with me around the assumption that I was fail-ill to live up to some standard he'd created, and now he was confronting the possibility that the standard itself had been wrong. I wanted you to be successful in ways that I could understand and measure, he continued, ways that would reflect well on me and fit into the world I'd built for myself. And when I chose a different path, I convinced myself that you hadn't chosen anything at all, that you were just drifting, avoiding real responsibility.
He looked directly at me for the first time since the conversation had started. It was easier than admitting that you'd found something meaningful that I couldn't comprehend. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Dr. Harrison, the same physician who had been treating my father's injuries, entered with a clipboard and the kind of expression that meant he had something important to discuss. Mr. Chen, I wanted to update you on your recovery progress, but I also wanted to discuss something else. He glanced at me, then back at my father. I understand that your daughter was the rescue specialist who extracted you from the vehicle. Yes, she was. I thought you should know that her actions almost certainly saved your life. The damage to your leg was severe enough that another hour of compromised circulation would have resulted in permanent disability or amputation. And Mrs. Chen's head injury could have been fatal without immediate medical intervention. My father absorbed this information with the same focused attention he'd once brought to quarterly earnings reports. Doctor, can you tell me about the overall rescue operation? How many people were involved? The Highway 15 accident? Final count was 43 vehicles and 67 total casualties. Remarkably, only 3 fatalities, which is considered extraordinary given the scale and complexity of the scene. And my daughter's role in that operation. Dr. Harrison consulted his notes. According to the incident commander's report, your daughter was responsible for 7 individual extractions, including 3 that required specialized technical rescue techniques. She also coordinated medical triage for the entire southeastern sector of the accident scene. 7 people, my father repeated quietly. Actually, Mr. Chen, that was just last Tuesday night. I asked about your daughter's overall record because I was curious myself. Dr. Harrison smiled with the kind of professional admiration that came from recognizing exceptional competence. In 8 years of emergency response work, she's been directly involved in rescues that have saved approximately 30 lives, not counting mass casualty events where individual contributions are harder to quantify. 30 lives. The number seemed to echo in the hospital room, carrying weight that no financial statement or performance review could match. 30 families who had been reunited,
30 people who had continued their lives because someone with specialized training and unwavering commitment had been willing to risk everything to help them. My father stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't the disappointment that had defined our relationship for so many years, or the confused frustration that had characterized our recent interactions. It was something that looked remarkably like awe. 30 people, he said after Dr. Harrison had left. It's not about the numbers, isn't it? He struggled to sit up straighter in his bed, wincing with the effort. Sophia, I've spent my entire career building a business that employs 47 people. I'm proud of that. But you've literally saved 30 lives. Your business provides for families, creates economic stability, contributes to the community. That matters too. But it's not the same thing, is it? His voice carried a note of wonder that I'd never heard before. When I make a successful deal or land a new client, people benefit financially. When you do your job, people get to go home to their families. The conversation continued for another hour, covering 8 years of misunderstandings and missed connections. My father asked detailed questions about my training, my equipment, the technical aspects of rescue work that he'd never bothered to learn about. For the first time in our relationship, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding what I'd built rather than measuring it against his own expectations. Why search and rescue? He asked finally. Of all the things you could have done with your life, why this? It was a question I'd asked myself countless times over the years, usually during the darkest moments of particularly difficult operations. The answer had evolved as I'd gained experience, but the core had remained constant. Because when everything goes wrong for someone, when they're facing the worst moment of their life, they need to know that there's someone trained and ready to help them. Someone who won't give up, won't cut corners, won't decide that the risk is too high or the situation is too complicated. And you're that someone? I'm one of those people. There are others who do this work, and we depend on each other. My father nodded slowly, processing information that was fundamentally reshaping his understanding of who his daughter was and what she'd accomplished. The training, the equipment, the time commitment, this isn't a hobby or a phase. This is a profession. It's a calling. And I never saw it. You never wanted to see it. 2 weeks later, I was back at work, coordinating a search operation for a missing child in the state forest, when my phone buzzed with a text message from my father. He'd been released from the hospital the day before and was beginning what would be a long process of physical therapy and recovery. The message was simple, but it carried more emotional weight than any of the elaborate birthday cards or holiday gifts he'd given me over the years. Saw the news report about the missing child case. Proud of the work you're doing. Let me know when you find her. I read the message twice, then saved it in the same folder where I kept thank you notes from families I'd helped. It was the first time my father had ever acknowledged my work as legitimate. The first time he'd expressed pride in something I'd chosen to do rather than disappointment in what I'd chosen not to do. 6 hours later, we found the child, alive and unharmed, but suffering from exposure and dehydration. As I carried her out of the forest toward the ambulance where her parents were waiting, I thought about the conversation I'd had with my father in the hospital room. He'd asked why I'd chosen search and rescue, and I'd given him the standard answer about being ready to help when everything went wrong. But the fuller truth was more complicated and more personal. I'd chosen this work because it was the one place where my value was never questioned, where my contributions were measured not in profit margins or social status, but in the simple, irreducible fact of whether someone lived or died. In a world where so much success was subjective and relative, search and rescue offered the clarity of absolute stakes. When I handed the child to her parents and watched them collapse in grateful tears, I understood something that had taken me 8 years to articulate. My father had spent my entire life trying to teach me the value of building something lasting, something that would make a difference in the world. He'd never realized that I'd been listening all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.